Sophie Hardy and the Changeling Hybrid by M.R. Dale, narrated by Leona Hall. Chapter 20, 2 hours earlier. Desmeralda took the small white ball off Sophie and began to run home as fast as she could. For the first time in 10 long years, she was about to get answers. As she flung open the front door and dashed inside, a tingle of nervous excitement came over her. As it did so, a blast of power ran through her body, and again something flashed through her memory. She shook herself to try and calm down, but she was all over the place. Again, memories that she didn't need right now arrived in her head. She shut them off immediately. Looking down at her hands, she saw the blue electricity pulsating through her veins. Breathing deeply, she sat down on the chair in the living room and placed what appeared to be the object that she had heard so much about over the last few weeks on the side of her head. Having read and seen so much about this revolutionary internet implant over the past few weeks, she was expecting something a bit more dramatic to happen when she put it on. Nothing did, so she removed the implant from the side of her head. As she did so, another memory, different to the others, flashed through her mind. The woman she knew as Jane standing in a long room filled with computer screens and tall stairs. What was that? She thought to herself. She stared down at the implant in her hand and put it to the side of her head again. To the Desmeralda in the chair, nothing happened, but to the copy of Desmeralda that was now facing Jane again in the long room, emotions were running extremely high. From Jane's point of view, Desmeralda stayed slightly longer this time. She seemed to scan her surroundings a little more, still clearly unsure of what was happening. Then she disappeared again in the blink of an eye. Miss Sissons realised that Desmeralda must have no idea what was going on, as Sophie couldn't have explained very well due to her haste, so she tracked the location of the implant and zoned in on it. Desmeralda was still sitting in the chair at home, completely unsure of what was happening. As she sat there, Jane appeared in the corner of her tiny living room. Alarmed at having a strange woman appear in her house, Desmeralda hunched her legs up on the chair and curled herself up to alleviate the shock. Jane just looked at her, smiled, and knelt next to her. She was clearly still distressed. "Hi," Jane said. Desmeralda didn't reply, but the blue in her veins started to shine through again as the emotion of the moment started to get away from her. Flashes of something happening in Zapfor from years ago, something important, ran through her mind. She put her hand to her eyes to shut it out. "Stick it on the side of your head and we can talk in a safe place," Jane said. Calming slightly, Desmeralda nodded and managed to get out the statement. "But I just stay here." "I know," Jane nodded. "You're being split into two. There is a real you here and the projection of you in my, let's call it my safe place. Then there's the real you that stays here. Your memories then marry up when you sign out. It's a bit disorientating, but you'll get used to it." Gradually finding her confidence, Desmeralda began to ask more questions. "Why do I need to be in two places?" "Because they're coming for you," Jane replied, "and we need to sort this situation as soon as possible, and this is the best way I can think of to do it." "Who are coming?" Desmeralda asked. "The Changelings, and we think they want to use you as a weapon against all the children on Earth." "Me? But why?" Desmeralda asked, getting more despondent. "Just put the implant on and project yourself. The you in the house will need to run if you hear anything unusual, and the you that comes with me will learn what it needs to." Jane was beginning to rush. Why do they want to use me as a weapon? What for? There was so much for Desmeralda to take in that she was just throwing questions at Jane. "Just come with me and run if you need to," Jane concluded and zoned out of the house. Thinking she had nothing to lose and lots of answers to gain, Desmeralda did so and found herself once again in the large room. The Desmeralda that stayed stood up from the chair and looked out of the window. There was nothing, but that didn't stop her from pacing, all the while trying to stay calm. Face to face with the woman from 10 long years ago, Desmeralda had practiced what she was going to say and ask a million times, but she found herself speechless. Jane walked forwards and offered her a chair, which she took. "You told me 10 years ago that I might start to show some changeling traits, didn't you?" she asked. Jane nodded. "Yes. That wasn't the whole truth, was it?" Jane shook her head. No, it wasn't. What am I? Desmeralda asked, feeling like she was about to well up. You're a hybrid, a half-changeling, Jane began to explain. Your mum was a full changeling, and your dad, well, we have no clue who he is or was. He must have been human. Who is we? Desmeralda asked. Experts from a long time ago who have long since gone, Jane replied in a very sombre tone, which to Desmeralda told her that Jane missed them, and so she didn't pry any further. I remember changelings from when I was little, Desmeralda then said. They were evil creatures who stole children. Yes, and you're the key to stopping them from coming again and taking even more. Since you got out 6 weeks ago, they've been tracking you and trying to take you to do something. We don't know what, but it must be to do with the children here on Earth. Jane realised she needed to slow down as Desmeralda was having to take an awful lot in. But why me? You're unique. You give them a link to every human on the planet. Before, they would only be able to pick on children they have been in direct contact with. You being half human means they have a link to the entire human race. You're the key to the ultimate door for them. They could potentially send children or adults to the underworld through a doorway that only you can create without being anywhere near them, using your telepathic capabilities. What capabilities? Desmeralda asked. I haven't got anything like that. Jane looked at her, which prompted her to do some soul-searching. The energy and the memories within me, they're changeling, aren't they? All these things that flash through my head when I'm emotional, and then I forget when I try to think about them later. They're what happened to my changeling side, she asked. Jane just nodded. But there was never anything there all the time I was growing up, Desmeralda appealed. It was always there. It just needed awakening, Jane replied. But they tried to take Kingsley from me when he was just a baby. Desmeralda was panicking now, making leaps in judgment that she'd never realised before. There was nobody there that night, Jane replied. What? Desmeralda asked, not quite believing what she was hearing. I saw her. She was hideous and deformed and tried to take him away. Jane looked at her and shook her head once more. That was you. That was the changeling in you waking up. I would never hurt Kingsley. He was and is everything to me. I know, but that high emotion and love that you felt for him that night were what woke up the changeling inside you. I had to get you out of there before you could hurt him, Jane explained. Tears made their way into Desmeralda's eyes. All her life was starting to make sense. Seeing and communicating with Kingsley whilst in the prison, it was all the changeling part of her leaping for him, and her love for him was so strong that it transcended the pulse that had been dampening every other mythical creature's powers. Why did you put me in that horrible place? Desmeralda asked. It was the safest place for you in Kingsley, Jane replied. Desmeralda looked at her doubtfully. For 10 years? You couldn't let me out or explain this to me for 10 years. The look of upset that was on her face suddenly transferred onto Jane's, and Desmeralda didn't like what she saw one bit. You weren't meant to stay there, Jane said, very apprehensively. What do you mean? Desmeralda asked, almost knowing that she wasn't going to like the answer. You were only supposed to be there for a few days, a week at the most, Jane said, looking down at the floor. So why was I there for 10 years? Desmeralda was getting cross at the vagueness Jane was presenting. Something happened. Everyone just vanished. The people who were supposed to be looking after you just vanished and never came back. Desmeralda tilted her head and quite angrily replied, But you're still here. You could have got me out. Why didn't you? Jane just shook her head. I'm so sorry. Desmeralda didn't need anything else and launched into a tirade. You made me miss out on my son growing up. He was passed from family to family with nobody able to look after him. He was an outcast who had no friends and nothing good in his life because I was stuck in there. Jane nodded and just kept trying to say how sorry she was. Desmeralda's emotions, however, were burning up, but the implant was making her powers redundant. No implant on Earth should be able to channel a changeling's powers in an avatar. As a result, she carried on. All those years, I was stuck in there with the freaks and the evils of the world. I could have learnt to control this and looked after him, couldn't I? A livid Desmeralda was now screaming at the mortified Jane. Jane just nodded. She couldn't bear to hide the truth from her any more. Desmeralda stood up and pushed her dreadlocks off her face, whereas Jane stayed seated and tried to calm herself. The guilt was destroying her. "We have to take care of you," Jane said, trying desperately to keep Desmeralda on side. Desmeralda punched the table, which made Jane jump. She hit it again and again and again, all the time shrieking with uncontrollable pain. You can't take care of me," she screamed at her. "You tried that once, and look what happened. I lost my boy." Jane stood up and turned away from Desmeralda, knocking over her chair in the process. She looked at the time and saw that it was 11:58. They had been talking for ages. She quickly decided that this meeting was not going to get any better and sent a message to Clara, Yasmin and Sophie that they should get to Desmeralda's house, now that they knew where it was, at dinner time, as they were the only children on Earth that couldn't be harmed by her because of their avatars. Turning back to Desmeralda, Jane found her punching tables, smashing screens and throwing things about the room. She looked at the blue in her skin. Even though she was just an avatar, the changeling power was beginning to fester, even though it shouldn't have been possible for a mythical to use powers through an avatar. And this time, it didn't look like anything could calm her down. "Desmeralda, please," Jane pleaded, getting seriously concerned that for some reason the changeling powers was somehow manifesting in an avatar. Desmeralda stopped what she was doing and just glared at her. "You can't take care of me or my son," she said in an eerily confident tone. "It's up to me to look after us both. Dangers are coming for this world that you can't begin to imagine." Jane saw the change in her. The tears had dried, and the anger was manifesting itself in a much calmer, assured tone. Something had changed her. In the panic, Jane tried to understand the final part of that sentence, but before she could utter another word, Desmeralda took the implant off the side of her head and disappeared. Jane quickly zoned into her house and found herself again in her living room, looking at the chair where she had been a little while earlier. In front of her, the chair was now empty. She ran through the house and towards the front door. As she did, she heard a scream. She picked up the pace, forgetting she could just zone to the front door if she wanted to. Arriving there, she found Clara and Yasmin both rolling on the pavement outside, having been thrown to the floor. In between them stood a creature which vaguely resembled a woman. Her veins with ice blue, and her hair had turned to a snake-like green, even darker than the green her skin had turned. The changeling turned her head and half looked at the woman she had known as Jane for 10 long years. Clara and Yasmin did their best to sit up. 10 years and a chance to raise my son you cost me. Now all humans on Earth will miss out on a chance to raise theirs. She's coming," Desmeralda said, embracing her changeling form as the transformation was complete. Miss Sissons looked up the road and saw an army of green hooded hags heading towards the 4 of them. Clara and Yasmin suddenly realised what was happening and zoned in behind Miss Sissons. As the women arrived at Desmeralda, they knelt on the floor as if greeting a god. One by one, Desmeralda walked through them and touched their heads. As she did so, a portal appeared around them and they disappeared. Touching the head of the last woman, Desmeralda herself disappeared with them, and all the quiet and calm of the short road in Pinkleton returned to how it should have been. Clara, Yasmin and Miss Sissons had no choice. They zoned back into scope, and Clara sent a message to Sophie. The Sophie Hardy saga was written and produced by M.R. Dale and narrated and produced by Leona Hall. If you enjoyed it and would like to continue to follow the adventures of Sophie and her friends in coming episodes, then please subscribe through one of the many podcast providers out there. The links for each of these can be found on our website. If you require more information, visit our many social media channels, or if you would like to purchase a copy of the book, then be sure to check out our website, www.sophiehardysaga.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy.